Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
Buongiorno. Today we're talking about TROY-EZZ.
No. What have I signed up for? TWAHH.
TWAHH.
At least it's TWAHH.
TWAHH. Okay, we'll go with TWAHH. A great dice selection board game that was voted on by our patrons. So that's why we're covering this. That's why we're doing this in our traditional deep dive format. So today it's only TWAHH, and we're going to talk about it based on our experience of playing it many, many times each.
Yeah. So as Jake said, we're really excited to be covering TWAHH. Frequently, a few times to a handful of times a year, our crew of patron supporters vote on the game that they think we should cover on the show next. And by next, I mean next from them, because we cover lots of games in between when you hear these episodes and when the next one that our crew of patrons will vote on. But in these episodes, we always like to highlight that and talk a little bit what our Patreon is. And if you've never heard of Patreon, it's just a platform where you can financially support the show you're listening to and give back so we can make more awesome content like this. There's various levels you could support at, and it lets you do cool stuff like vote on future deep dives, boost and potentially select future bonus episodes. We have one on silly questions coming up that we got to because we reached a certain number of patron supporters overall. Our next milestone for that is 35 total patrons. So we'll have another bonus episode that we'll release for the main feed. Our patrons also get a sneak peek of our upcoming schedule, access to our show notes, and various other bonuses like annotated notes that Jake and I put together, collection tours, fancy roles and names in our Discord. Shout outs to our most recent crew member, Space Odyssey, Red Eye J.
Space Oddity.
Oddity. Did I say Odyssey?
Yeah.
Oddity. Jared. Yeah.
Thank you so much to our patrons. And I think without further ado, let's get right into the show. Let's start, as we always do, with our ratings and reviews. Did I miss something? What am I messing up?
No, you did great.
Okay, like I was saying that and I was looking at your face and you were just cringing. So maybe that's a little preview. Brendan, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, Jake. TWAHH is a bit like a cult classic hero. There's a lot here and enough for almost anyone to find something they admire or enjoy. Cutting interaction, heads down Euro optimization puzzles, swingy dice, an enticing blend of strategy and tactics. But despite admiring the design of TWAHH greatly, I find it's a game that I have more fun thinking about and discussing than I do playing it in practice. So for me, TWAHH is just a great 7.5 out of 10.
All right.
Our patrons are going to kick us off the show. Okay, go on.
Big TWAHH hater over there. TWAHH hater energy coming straight through my computer screen. I can't even stand it. Anyway, so I've played TWAHH 12 times now. All of those plays have been on Board Game Arena. I'd like to put that out there because this is a game I'm dying to play live. And sometimes you get the sense when you're playing games, we play a lot of games online because that's sort of the way we can get a dozen plays in before covering it on this show in a deep dive format that feels like authentically a deep dive. And sometimes it feels like we get a really strong sense of what that game is like on the table. And sometimes it doesn't feel that way. And TWAHH is a game that sticks out to me as a game that I feel like plays better on the table than it does play online because of some really interesting design choices that I'm sure we'll get into later. Having said that, caveat aside, I really like TWAHH.
Yeah, I knew you would.
Yeah, so dice drafting, dice sort of action selection is probably my favorite mechanism. I love that essentially every time. I haven't met a case of that I haven't loved, and TWAHH is obviously playing right in that space. And I've enjoyed grappling with this puzzle, which is no surprise to me. So I'm putting it at a 9. It's a game I really love to play. It's a game I want to keep playing and learning more about, but I'm ready to play it on the table.
I'm throwing the whole schedule out. Never, just kidding. We'll get back to it. But Jake, on the spot right now, does TWAHH feel like a Stefan Feld game to you?
That's a great question. I think it does. I think kind of the hallmarks of the Stefan Feld school of design for me, and this is something that I talked about a lot with my friend Tyler in St. Louis, is that it's really the hallmark of it isn't so much point salad as it is novel action selection mechanism. And I think TWAHH is a great example of novel action selection mechanism. It also has that punctuated waning decision space, right? Where you have a huge pool of options early on, and then you're sort of just navigating your way through that pool of options, which is diminishing down over the course of each round. So yeah, right on point, I think, as a Stefan Feld-esque design.
I
But
asked that in part because Jake loves Stefan Feld, and because when I played this, it reminded me, maybe unfairly, of Bruges quite a bit, and the high search just felt Feldy to me.
Yeah.
But let's talk about TWAHH and Pearl games and the game background. What do you say, Jake?
Perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
I know. So TWAHH, fascinatingly, came out in 2010, which to me is sort of shocking because it feels like a very modern design with a lot of its decisions. It's super polished and clean. It's really approachable. But in 2010, it was released by Pearl Games, and it was their inaugural game that they released. Shortly thereafter, they were picked up, I think a few years later, by Asmodee. They'd released TWAHH, which was a big hit, Ginkgopolis, which was a big hit. They're also known for Deus, and they recently announced that Asmodee was actually shutting the studio down. But the owner of the studio, Sébastien Dujardin, who's actually one of the designers of TWAHH, went on to Board Game Geek and said, I'm going to try to keep the catalog, try to keep it in hand. So interestingly, at the recording of this episode, the future of Pearl Games is sort of up in the air. And what will happen to this catalog of games is kind of up in the air.
I didn't even realize this shows how much due diligence I do on the show. I didn't realize this game was that early. I would have assumed for certain this was released after a game like Castles of Burgundy, which actually released a year after TWAHH. So perhaps I should say that this Stefan Feld is really more of the Dujardin, Georges, Orbanian school of board game design.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to sort of really highlight that, and I'm glad you noted on it again, Jake, because I was shocked to learn that too. It feels like so many of the games that we've previously covered on the show, like Castles of Burgundy, really the TWAHH builds on those. But like you're saying, in some ways, it really feels like it laid the groundwork for a lot of the clean Euro design that would follow in the subsequent 10 years. And to me, feels like it could have come out yesterday. Like it feels so polished and clean. And yeah, it's really impressive that it's a 13-year-old game.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would push back a little bit. To me, there are weird design decisions in this game that would not be made today.
Okay.
Which I think now, knowing that it's an older game, makes perfect sense. I was sort of interpreting this as like, what an interesting design riff on sort of the more elegant Castles of Burgundy. But now I can so clearly see Castles of Burgundy being like the more kind of streamlined version of some of the things that are happening in TWAHH. So we'll talk more about that when we get into the deep dive.
And then just real quick, this game is designed by Sébastien Dujardin, who I mentioned was the publisher at the helm of Pearl Games. He also did TWAHH Dice and Black Angel and Deus. It's also designed by Xavier Georges, who's known for Carnegie, also worked on Ginkgopolis, and also co-designed Black Angel with Dujardin. And then Alain Orban also did Black Angel and Tournai. So sort of three designers who came together, did this like inaugural game for Pearl Games, and would all stay involved with designing together on Black Angel and on future games. So I know there's a lot of games in there that are sort of, maybe when they were released released to critical success, but not huge commercial success. And over time have kind of been celebrated and well-known on Board Game Geek and have grown in their renown, I would say, within the market. TWAHH is a game that I've been hearing about for years and years now. So I'm really excited to get to play it and that we get to feature it on the show. And that's why I mentioned that they almost feel a little bit like cult classics. Like it took connoisseurs who could really appreciate what these designs were trying to accomplish to sort of say, no, these are standouts in this sort of Euro optimization genre, doing cool things that are unique and different than you might think of bog standard Euro games as being.
Yeah, well put. I think I have not played it, but Ginkgopolis, from what I know about it, feels exactly like what a cult classic is in our hobby, right? There is a group of fans of it that will extol it and talk about it whenever they get the opportunity. It doesn't feel like it has super wide market reach at this point, but those who know about it, they want to talk about it.
And so, maybe one we should consider talking about in the future on the show, but I guess
it's definitely one we should play since it's on Board Game Arena. And now it's an interesting collection of games that these designers have been involved with. And I like TWAHH enough, certainly, that it makes me want to check out some of their other design offerings.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, Brendan, let's jump into your separately recorded rules overview. And then listeners, meet us back on the other side where we'll deep dive this game.
TWAHH is a strategic dice-driven Eurogame for 2 to 4 players. Played over rounds, players assemble a workforce of differently colored dice, white, red, and yellow, and use those dice to take actions printed on variable action cards, pursuing victory points associated with those actions, but also working towards hidden game end scoring conditions. It behooves players to try to assess what hidden scoring conditions their opponents are working towards, and to work towards those as well, as the game end scoring objectives represent a large potential scoring opportunity. In TWAHH, players each have dice in their own personal pools, but can pay to use dice rolled by their opponents as well. This provides interaction and balloons out the decision space, as players are presented with a tremendous amount of options. Though, due to variability of dice, they're likely only to have a few good options at the start of each round. Each game, the available action cards grow round by round, and certain combinations of these cards provide different strategic paths through the game. After a variable number of rounds based on player count, the player with the most points, taking into account hidden scoring cards, events, activity card points, and points gained working towards the cathedral, or perhaps lost if a player ignores this activity, is crowned the victor. Well, there's a lot more mechanisms and scoring opportunities at play, many of which I just teased, including a neat event system that players communally have to work to keep under control. It'd be tough to delve much deeper into TWAHH without teaching the full game. So equipped with this brief overview, let's get back to the discussion.
Thank you, Brendan, as always, for that rules overview to not give everybody every rule, but give people a sense of how this game plays. I will say, having heard a lot about TWAHH before checking it out, and then even after checking it out, TWAHH was not an easy and intuitive game to learn. It definitely took me a few plays before it started clicking for me. Just kind of the general flow, what you should be focusing on and trying to do on your turn. So I might encourage listeners to at least take a look at what the board looks like, so you can see what Brendan's talking about with the way these dice are kind of laid out and owned by certain players, but then kind of used by anyone.
I will say I kept our rules overview shorter than average just because there's so much in TWAHH that's sort of interdependent in the way that the rules build upon each other, that I felt like this was going to be a tough one of teaching in a bite-sized manner without just teaching the whole game, which would have been too much. So maybe we can, as we go, provide even more contextualization than we normally would. But I'll say, Jake, one thing, let's talk about maybe the type of decision space first, because you mentioned punctuated waning, which it is. You have this pool of dice that builds up and then diminishes over the course of each round, which is sort of that classic style that you like from Azul or Castle of Burgundy.
Exactly. Just put a finer point on it for those maybe who haven't heard us talk about these terms before. And, you know, if you're a new listener, welcome. We have more people listening to this show than ever these days, which is fantastic. A waning decision space being that the decision space shrinks over the course of play, and punctuated meaning that there are specific moments in the game where sort of the decision space is refilled and becomes large again, and then over play wanes down. So that would be at the beginning of each round when all the dice are rolled again and now become available to players, and then will then diminish as actions are taken, which all rely on using one or more dice.
But objection, the activity cards grow over the course of the game. The available almost worker placement locations, it's not quite that. You have to sort of buy the right to use these activity cards once, and then once you've done that, you have the right to use them with your pool of dice, which are kind of like your workers for the rest of the game. Those are actually growing over the course of the game, more revealed each round, so the decision space overall becomes more complex, though you might not opt into using all these cards. Then at the same time, you might end up with more dice or fewer dice, depending on if your workers have been bumped out of the different principal buildings, the city hall for yellow dice, or the count's palace for red, or the bishopric for white. So you might end up with very few dice, and if you end up in a bad spot with very little money, you could have a really narrow decision space where you can't buy other people's dice, you don't have dice of your own. So to me, this feels, there's a lot going on in this game. It's not necessarily as clean as some of the games that we try to fit into this waxing, waning, dynamic, static mold. But to me, it feels pretty dynamic overall.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's certainly more dynamic than Castles of Burgundy, which is a great example of a classic punctuated waning decision space where you always will have on your turn 2 moves no matter what, and then the tiles on the board are what are going down over the course of play in each round. And you're right. Certain rounds of the game, you may be in a position to do more, take more actions, and certain rounds less. But for me, I mean, and we can disagree on this. Like for me, like the core essence of like how I feel playing the game, like what I'm thinking about,
Yeah.
is mostly restricted by the dice that
Yeah.
are available in the pool available to me. But if you want to call this a dynamic punctuated waning decision space, I'm there for it.
Great. Consider it modified. I think TWAHH getting that title is more than perfect based on how much is going on in this game. Jake, you've mentioned that when you've heard people talk about TWAHH, maybe it didn't quite align perfectly with your experience of learning it initially. And I had a really similar experience for myself, because I feel like when I hear people talk about this game, the two things that people primarily talk about are the using other people's dice, that you have dice in your own pool, but you can pay to use other people's dice, and also the hidden objectives and how that creates a sort of like air of potential for bluffing, which those are really important parts of TWAHH. But also something that stands out to me is just the sheer size of the decision space. There's so many options presented to you at the start of a given round of different combinations of dice that you could put together to use different activity cards. You could work on the cathedral. You could fight the events that are building up at the bottom of the table. And you can also choose how much you want to invest on a given turn. Do you want to spend all your money early on? Do you want to bide your time and kind of see what happens? Do you want to spend some time re-rolling dice? Not that that costs you time, but it costs you're just, does it make sense to re-roll now or wait to do that? I think there's a lot going on here.
Influence, which is
exactly
one of the two resources in the game, influence and gold.
Yep.
There's a ton going on. Are we going to talk about the secret objective cards now?
Let's save it.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that is such a weird thing that almost deserves its own section.
Yeah.
The thing that makes it complicated to learn for me is I think like the board is less intuitive than a lot of more modern games. There's some kind of difficult to understand iconography. All the different building spaces that you put your workers into so that you will be able to roll one of the dice of that associated color into your color pie, piece of the pie chart, whatever. Those work slightly differently in each case, like how the bumping works. They cost a variable amount to put your worker into, which is that you kind of have a good supply and a bad supply of workers. Once you have a worker that's been bumped out, you can place it in for free. If you don't, you can pay 2 influence to put a worker in there, but you also have a limited supply of workers, so that if you have used all of your workers, then you would have to move a worker from a different space in order to put it in a building or on an activity card. And in that case, I think it's free again, because you're not buying out of supply. So everything makes sense. Like it is a complete system. And I think that it leads to an interesting decision space. But I think what I'm hoping I convey by that small piece of this is it's a game where every rule leads you to a different part of the board. Like to understand that, you have to understand this over here. And then that cycles into this other mechanism over there, which is like a really cool ecosystem to play around in once you've got it. But that is something that just makes it really difficult to learn compared to a game like Castles of Burgundy, which is really a game that they both feel like medium weight games.
Yep. And to add to that, every play of TWAHH is going to feel very different because the activity cards really do inform your strategic path through the game. And as they're revealed, you might shift slightly because they inform the actions that you can take. Some of them might make for a more flexible game with a certain color, some of them less. And you're always trying to solve some core problems, like how do I get more money? How am I going to effectively get influence? How am I going to make the most of my dice? All these sorts of, what's the right amount of workers to have at a given time? If you're Jake, 30. Not really. The most you can have is, I don't know, what's the most you've ever gotten out there on the table, Jake? Maybe like 8 to 10?
I think I think 8 to 10 is, 8 is probably like
a ton.
The most you would ever want for any circumstance, because you only have 12 workers total. So you want some, like the activities are really important and valuable actions to take. So you can't just have only dice. Like that would not work for you.
Yeah, totally. I'm a little bit jesting just because in a lot of our games, you sort of have gone this big dice strategy and it's worked out pretty effectively for you. But yeah, I think the final thing maybe in this entry sort of section that we always do where we characterize the overall decision space, I'd say is we like to discuss the clarity. And to me, Jake, this game is so fuzzy from a terms of
very
how
opaque.
clear is what are you trying to accomplish and how are you going to accomplish it? You know what you're trying to accomplish, but not even fully because of those hidden objectives cards we're going to talk about later. So a lot of this game is about trying to find your footing. You don't even know the future actions that you're going to be able to take as those activity cards get revealed round by round. So you're kind of feeling out the table, trying to build a lot of the early rounds in this game, Jake, to me feel a lot like building an insurance policy for the decisions you might make, trying to make sure you have some money, trying to make sure you have some influence, that you're not falling behind too much, but you're not overcommitting either.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the decision space is very opaque. The waning nature of it helps with that a bit because by the time you get to your last or second to last turn in the round, there's only a few things that you even would be able to do.
Yeah.
If you wanted to. So the game is helping you with that to create something that doesn't feel like it's just going to cause you super AP.
Yeah.
It's almost restrictive enough that you can't just sit there and think forever. But yeah, I do agree. It's really difficult a lot of times to think through the value of what any given action is going to be. And I think part of that goes to the cyclical sort of nature of the economy in this game. Like one thing that seems good to do in most cases is fighting off the threat cards that come out. So you can
The
spend
events.
the events, yeah. So you can spend dice to fight these events, and basically that's a little bit of like majority scoring. So if you fight off the most of that event, so maybe there's 4 spots available. If I fight it 3 times and Brendan fights it once, then I have the majority. So I'll score the top amount of points on that card, and he'll score the second amount of points on that card. But if I do it all myself, then I get top and bottom. So that feels like mostly a good and effective thing to always be doing a little bit because it gives you influence and it also gives you points. But there's also this element where like the events do something which may or may not benefit or harm somebody more. And I feel like that takes it to a level of like, I can't even think about that. Like I only think about like using my dice efficiently to fight events. But there's just always another thing to be considering that makes the decision space just a little bit less clear in all facets of the game.
And interestingly, because the events are good and you want to approach them, there's a reason why you'll be doing that. And because those actions are useful, you have a reason why you might be going after a certain action at a given time, right? Also, the hidden objective cards, the characters, there's also Henry the First, who gives endgame points for completing these event cards. So that's where it's sort of tough to think through, okay, is Jake just going after these events because it's a good point scoring opportunity and his dice rolled in such a way that he just had the right dice to take out this event card? Do I need to be working towards the events? For me, it gets to the point of this is so fuzzy that, as Jake was saying, I just often kind of take a step back and say, what's the most efficient action I can take on my turn?
Yeah. And I think that the game is balanced in a way that sort of heuristic of like, I just want to use my dice and money effectively gets you pretty far. I don't think you're going to win against a really experienced table doing that. And that's where I think this game probably has a really high skill ceiling to sort of navigate all the different moments where you might break that heuristic. But you could definitely play the game and be competitive, just trying to play almost purely tactically, just take the game as it comes to you. It's my turn. I have a 4 white dice, and this event requires a 4 white dice to fight one spot on it. I'm just going to like do that. That gets you pretty far. But yeah, I think hopefully this gives you a sense that, wow, this is an opaque game. And after 12 plays, we're barely scratching the surface and like understanding the robustness of the strategy and tactics presented to players.
And I think that TWAHH is really interesting from that perspective too, Jake, because the activity card setup makes your use of different activity cards that come out committal. You have to commit to a strategy by putting a worker there, typically paying a cost of not a trivial amount of coins, right? Some of them cost 6 coins to use. Some of them are cheaper to sort of get your worker down the first time. And I think that forces commitment in terms of strategy, but then the dice rolling screams like this is a tactical game. You have to play the best dice that are on the table, especially compounded by the fact that you can buy each other's dice. So I want to highlight that point even a little bit more, that just to me the standout thing of TWAHH and why I think that it has such a loud sort of group of people who love this game and have been talking about it for so long, if it is sort of that like cult of TWAHH lovers, is because the mix of strategy and tactics is so phenomenal, and it rewards repeat plays and it empowers you the more you play. The more you play, the better you're going to get at TWAHH. And I think that, we've covered a lot of games on the show recently where that's definitely true, but I think it's more true in TWAHH than a lot of the games that we've talked about. And it's just fun. I've really enjoyed playing more and more TWAHH and getting better and better at trying to approach those, how to use the activity cards the best, and then parsing that with the dice that I actually end up rolling, or sometimes even more importantly, other people roll or the neutral player rolls.
Yeah. I don't think you're necessarily wrong, but I have a slightly different take on it. I find this game is 75% tactical plus. Yeah. And maybe that's just the way I approach the game, but I don't actually get that much out of the strategic elements. And you're talking about sort of the game wanting you to commit to certain activity cards because you have to put your worker on that spot and pay money, but you also get like a big boon in points from doing that.
Sure.
So I think, and you're paying the die cost when you place it. So I think a lot of times, if I just activate it once or twice, I'm getting plenty of value out of that. Like I don't feel the need to, and maybe I'm not good at this game, so really experienced TWAHH players could be like, I'm wrong on this count, but it feels to me less committal in that way. I think the reason that TWAHH has this huge cult following and that the people who love it really love it is because of the way it incorporates so many highly interactive elements in what feels like a very traditional Euro game. It almost has that sort of like Hansa Teutonica vibe going for it, where I feel like the thing I always hear about that game is like, it's like a Euro game, but it's also interactive. How crazy is that? And this is sort of like if Castles of Burgundy, that kind of genre of Euro game was highly, highly interactive. And I think that is what appeals to so many people.
So let's name all the interactive elements that I could think of and then see if you have any more you can add to them. So there's buying each other's dice, bumping workers in those principal buildings, the event card majorities, progress on the cathedral, and also guessing, hiding, bluffing / fainting the hidden goals, those character cards.
I think the only other one I can think of is that the activity cards are also limited.
Nice.
Or no, they're not limited, but only the first 2 people who go there get points, and the first gets the most points. So it's like a race to get down there. I believe you can still play on an activity card that already has 2 people on it, but you just don't get any points.
Yep.
So you're probably losing.
Bad.
Yeah, I think you're kind of done if you find yourself in that situation.
That's 6 different systems that have an interactive bent, and it's almost every system in the game.
Yeah, everything is absolutely tied back to this. And maybe now is when we should talk about the character cards, because that element alone makes, everything you're doing like potentially interactive in some way. I don't know.
These, Jake, the way these are designed, they're a substantial amount of points depending on how much you achieve in them. And they're set up such that there's thresholds. So, for example, I had mentioned Henry the First, which rewards you at the end of the game, and everyone at the table, not just you, not just the person who has it, but you flip it face up, and everyone gets paid off of everyone's character cards, these hidden endgame objectives. In that example, if you had 1 or 2 event cards in your possession, you get 1 victory point. If you had 3 or 4, you'd get 3, and if you had 5 or more, you'd get 6 victory points. So it scales up pretty quickly. Yeah. And there's similar ones for having money, for having influence, for having progress on the cathedral, for having workers on activity cards, all of these different elements of where you could be pushing your strategic path towards.
Yeah. So this is without a doubt for me the most interesting design element in this game. I feel like this is where this game really separates itself from anything else I've played, where you have hidden shared objective cards, meaning that everything that you're doing can potentially be cluing in your opponents to that card that you're holding, which figuring out what card Brendan's holding in our game, and in a 2-player game, we each have 2 of these cards, that is such key information in sort of illuminating what is so opaque about the decision space. And I think that's part of the reason why it feels so opaque. It's like, you know what you want to be doing because you know your card, but then everything else, it's so difficult to like say like, okay, is it better to fight an event here, or is it better to go up the cathedral track, or just like get another dice in the next round, because you just have no sense of, and all of those things could be hidden objectives at the end of the game.
And I think interestingly, Jake, for me, what's sort of neat about it is early. Okay, so these are these are sort of destinations that you're trying to guide your strategic paths towards. But your ship that you're trying to move through that space, if I can use a metaphor, is pretty slow, right? If you're trying to get 5 or 6 event cards, that's not something you can do instantly. That's something you have to build through over the course of the game. So it behooves you to start on that early. If you need to amass a lot of money, it's kind of a similar thing, but sometimes less so. But I think what's cool about TWAHH is that all of the things that you're trying to do are just good to do.
Yeah.
There's none of the objectives are things that you wouldn't do unless you had this card. So it's really about which directions you push the furthest in. And I find that it makes the early game even more interesting than it might be, where it's like, oh, Jake or Tyler went up on money to like 22. Did the dice roll just enable a really bursty turn and it was the right time in the game to get a lot of money? Or was it that there's a hidden character card in play that means that it's good to have money and I should also be trying to force that outcome, even though maybe I end up paying more for it because the dice rolls don't quite go my way? There's lots of, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's lots of ways to hide behind the mechanisms of the game to obfuscate what's going on and why you might be doing it. And I think that makes it even more interesting. We talked about the drunk in Blood on the Clock Tower as one of the roles. Totally different genre of game, a social deduction game where this player doesn't know the role that they're playing in the game and whether it's true or not. This player is actually truly believes they're a character that they aren't and are being fed hidden information by the narrator, by the moderator of that game. And here you kind of all feel a little bit drunk when you're playing because it's hard to guess sometimes what cards are in play. And that's part of the fun.
Yeah. I don't know how much, like, I think definitely guessing what other character cards are in the game is something that happens in every game. I'm not sure, like, to the extent that bluffing really makes sense, at least, like, in an intentional way. Like, it can be, like, a passive benefit to doing something else. Like, oh, okay, I think that Brendan has the cathedral card, so because he's gone up 3 in the cathedral and it's early in the game. So I start doing that, right? And then player number 3 is like, everybody's going up the cathedral. It's like definitely in the game, right? So it sort of has like this shared whatever, ecosystem that's happening. But Brendan maybe was just like, his dice just resulted in, I got a bunch of 1s and 2s and whites, and that was the best thing I could do with them. And you're right, you're not necessarily like intentionally bluffing it. It's just, but it's created that like sense that definitely somebody's got this card when nobody does. Did you like this mechanism though?
I think this mechanism is
I think it's
one
going
of
to be
the
polarizing for people.
one of the examples where I like thinking about it and talking it more than maybe I like it in practice, just because I wish in some ways that there are even more tells. It's sort of there and it really matters, but just mechanically at times it's tough to be able to parse. But I think it's cool. I think it defines what TWAHH is. I think this game wouldn't have quite the same je ne sais toi without it.
Well, it's I mean, again, it's like a perfect, I think the cult classic example is so perfect here, because I think without this mechanism, maybe this game is something that like a broader group of people like, but it doesn't have the same, like more people like it. More people are like, this is a 7 out of 10, but
It's
you're not going to get that like critical core group of people that are like, this is a 10 out of 10 without this mechanism. So I think I'm starting, the more I play it, the more I'm starting to get behind it. But learning this game because of this mechanism is, again, just like such a huge pain. And even now when I'm playing this game, I feel like I'm looking up in the rule book what all these things are, like every time I play multiple times a game, because it's not just enough to remember what all the character cards are that could be in the game. You have to remember like all the specific thresholds, and they're not all the same, right? It's like the max of to get the most points for having your workers in the central buildings is 7, but it's 6 for going on the activity cards. So you can't just remember it's like 6 for all these things, where it's like you need to have 20 gold but 12 influence, stuff like that. And then each of those has 3 different benchmarks for success. So to play this game, even at like the lowest base level, I feel like you have to have perfect knowledge of what these are, which just means you're going to be looking at a lot.
But there are only 6 of them, which in the base game, which does keep it somewhat within reach. And interestingly, so that means when you're playing with 4 people, you're kind of trying to guess what people aren't necessarily going for as much as what they are, which adds this interesting sort of like mirrored objectives where it's trying to like see what people maybe aren't doing as much as they might normally do across the aggregate of the whole table. I'll also say, Jake, I think it's really fun when you have some of these are easier to get towards the end of the game than others, depending on the activities that are out, right? So the one that you get more victory points if you want influence, I had a fun game where the hunting activity was out. Hunting's an activity where you get 3 influence for every red dice given to this card divided by the value of it divided by 3. So just you can use it to burst a lot of influence towards the end of the game. So it feels really good to sort of, if you roll a couple of red 6s and you put down maybe 18 value of down at a time and you get a boatload of influence from it, like 15 in one turn, that's a really exciting way to potentially end the game and not tip anyone off that you had the card. So I love that there's cards that lend, these character cards that lend more towards maybe you want to set this up early game because it's just good to have this stockpile, or maybe you want to try to burst into it at the end. And I think it's cool that TWAHH game by game has different ways that you might approach the same problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main thrust of these being in the game, at least I have found, is that it makes you want to do everything well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like the players that do the best in this game are generally succeeding in most or all areas of the game, right? And then maybe just at the end, like you're saying, okay, I'm going to like now push in this final round to like achieve like the top benchmark on like 2 or 3 of these cards if possible. But it's not like I don't know. And I could be wrong because I have only played it a dozen times, which, is a decent number, but in a game like this, it's difficult to say. Like, perhaps there is a viable path to victory in this game. That's just like, I'm never going to put anything on the cathedral, or I'm not going to fight any events at all. But in my experience, it hasn't played out that way.
I think that I'm having a funny experience right now, Jake, because the more we talk about it, just like I said in my sort of opening review, the more I realize how much I like TWAHH and really admire it. Like, should I have rated an 8? Should I have rated an 8.5?
I think let your impressions speak for themselves, because you even said in that impressions, like, you like this game academically. And I do too, right? Like, I think this mechanism is such a cool food for thought thing, but a lot of people aren't going to like it. And also what I said at the beginning, right? It makes sense that this game was a 2010 game. And then this is the exact type of mechanism that is streamlined and developed out of games today. It's developed into something that is just like in Castles of Burgundy, like, here are the goals, and now we're just going to like race to them, because that just makes it such an easier first and more fun first play than, wait, what's going on? And then at the end of the game, it's like, okay, I didn't really realize how all these cards worked and stuff, right? I just think it's not something you would see today. And frankly, I think that's too bad. I playing more of these older games, and even actually Findorf being a new game that feels like had a different design goal. Like, I think that's cool, and I think it'd be awesome if more games today are sort of developed with different design goals than just like elegance and fun first play. But I think the market is clearly showing what is rewarded in development and game design.
Easy for us to say, co-hosts of a podcast where we like to play games 10 plus times to deep dive them, to say we want more games where they're better at the 10th time you play them. But I think it's a fair point, and I totally agree. One other thing, Jake, that I think is really interesting about this game and why you might want to play it more than one time is the feel can really dramatically shift based on the dice that are rolled. Lots of dice get rolled in this game. So it's not typically common that you have just like a terrible game where all the dice come out really low, but it can happen where you have like a below average game where it feels sort of sluggish in your ability to pursue points. And the flip side is you can have games where everyone's rolling 5s and 6s and you have a lot of ability to do stuff on the table. Points are flying. It's a great time in TWAHH, and it's a really dynamic sort of game where the numbers are a little bit larger. And you historically have really enjoyed games like that, where you can have sort of a play where it feels more subdued, more muted, and a play where the variability of the randomizing element just allows it to pop a little bit more. I think, interestingly, there's a ton of mitigating mechanics in this game. One of them...
I was just can I just add on to your point just to emphasize it, which is in my plays, the lowest winning score is 39 and the highest winning score is 56.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big band of numbers, So yeah, I think that definitely bears it out. Mostly this game will be won in the mid to high 40s, it looks like. But it absolutely has the potential for way more or way less, depending on, and I think that mostly depends on, just the value of dice roll. A lower average die value game is going to be a lower scoring game.
Yeah. TWAHH is a game of many, many ideas. And I think the one that maybe hooked people initially, it's a game about dice rolling that doesn't feel bad when you roll low values, because the dice you're rolling are just kind of, you're putting them in the pool and you get money if other people use them. And
it
you
feels
can use
a little
them for
bad.
free.
You would
It does feel a little bad.
You would rather have high values for sure.
You would, but there's a lot of ways to get around it. You can use money to buy other people's dice. There's also neutral dice in the pool, just trying to get the number of dice in the economy up. You can use influence to re-roll or adjust dice. So a 1 can be a 6 for 4 influence, and you can always re-roll dice for 1. So there's lots of ways that the game sort of says, we want there to be a good mix of numbers. Jake, there's sort of the base actions that any player can do at any time with dice, right? Agriculture. You can turn 2 value of yellow dice into money. You can use influence to manipulate the value of dice. I really like those elements. It's one more thing that you have to learn you can always do outside of the activity cards, but they kind of action smooth. They're sort of things that you want to exist in the game that kind of have to be there. I think it's also why the cathedral always allows you to get a little bit of influence and a few points, just because you need a way to get those in the game if the activity cards came out in kind of a funky way. But I find the more I play, the more I really enjoy trying to push my luck a little bit with re-rolling dice, or I'll pay 4 influence at this point to turn a 1 into a 6. Usually that's worth it.
Yeah.
Especially if you're sitting on a lot of influence.
Yeah, I think generally I've done the re-rolling one quite a bit. I like spending 1 influence to re-roll. Like, I feel like I would almost rather give it like 2 re-rolls than just switch it to a 6 or something right away, unless I really needed the 6. So that's kind of fun too. Like, it gives players the option of like, do you want the sure thing or do you want to push your luck a little bit? And in our last game, I rolled a 1 twice in a row. It's like, damn, devastating. So it's fun that type of play can exist in the game. But yeah, I don't find myself often using those because I don't know. The reroll one seems like the best value. Spending like the yellow for money seems just really bad efficiency wise.
I think it is pretty bad.
You
but
need
I
to
think
have
there's
a
times
way
where you
to get
have to
money
do it.
for sure.
Yeah.
And like if it's the last, you have nothing else to do on your turn, sure, I'll turn a 2 into a coin that I'll have next round or whatever.
We were talking, Jake, maybe this is a good time to mention this. We were talking a lot about how, or I was at least, how polished the game feels, how modern it feels. One of the things that's not that way is the amount of division the game asks you to do. I feel like if I designed a game with this much division and took it to a group of playtesters, they would be like, Brendan, what are you doing? There's too much math in this game. And in a way there is. It's kind of clunky to have to be like, okay, so I have a 6 here. If I bought Jake's 5, that'd take me to 11. Then I'm going to use this neutral die that costs me this amount of coins, and then I'll get this many actions when I divide that value by 3.
Yeah, or like there's also multiplication. Like some of the buildings that I really like to use is like I can turn 1 white die into 3 yellow die of the same value. So it's like, okay, now I've got a 6, so that means I've got 18 worth of value. And like, how many times can I split 18 into 4 again? like that. I mean, that stuff's all over this game, which
That's
is
a
fun though.
yeah, it's
I don't know.
okay.
I don't know. Here's the thing. I would not say I disagree with you in that this feels like a super polished and modern game. I honestly think it's the opposite, right? And that's why I feel like no, this game wouldn't be developed and designed today. What it feels like when you say this feels like a game that could be, published today or designed yesterday or whatever, I think what you're speaking to is like it's just as fun as a game that a modern game that we just played Ark Nova or whatever. Like this game is just as fun. There's
I think
nothing
it's
like
more fun than Ark Nova.
Okay, fair enough. But there's nothing like inherently better about what modern games are doing than this. But I do think it shows its age in some of these design decisions that we're talking about now. And I think maybe sort of a thesis I'm coming to as we have more of these is like just that the design goal of modern games that are being designed and published today is leans so much into creating elegant systems.
Yeah.
And the systems in this game are not elegant in my mind.
I think for me, when I'm saying polish, maybe what I mean is that you just said the design objective of the game, which I think the design objective of the game is interactive Euro.
Yeah.
Is so fully realized. And it's fully realized across like 6 different mechanisms. So to me, that's what makes it feel polished. There's
You're
no
talking
mechanism.
about self-actualization.
Yeah. Exactly. The game is fully self-actualized. And I think that there's nothing that sticks out as like, oh, this game would be way better without this mechanism.
Totally agree.
It all feels like it belongs here. Even the event cards, which the event cards kind of feel like the one that you're all trying to contribute to. And maybe I want to contribute. I know I want to win this event card, but I'm just going to contribute 1 die now, even though I could contribute more because I want other people to come along with me. But then I want to be the one to finish it. To me, that's another one of those ideas where it's like, wow, this is a lot going on in this game. And maybe a modern sensibility would say, let's cut that system. It's just too much. But TWAHH ends up being even more interesting for having it because then there's this whole other system of fighting black dice that we didn't even talk about, which I find to be really fun and funny, where the start player has to sort of take the first whack. You have to like spend down your dice. Red dice count double when fighting these black dice that are rolled at the start of the round. And if you don't deal with events, more of these black dice are likely to come out and kind of chip away at how much everyone at the table can do. And the first player just has to attack the most powerful die, but they don't have to spend all their red die to do it. So it's kind of funny to sort of be like, okay, I'll take out this 1 die and now over to you, Jake, and see how much you want to kind of chip away at it.
I think
it's
that's
a nice interactive moment.
Yeah, I don't know. Did we include that in our interactive?
That's another one.
That's another one. Yeah, and it's funny too to be like, okay, I want to do this much efficiently, and then I can make the next person in like an uncomfortable spot with the dice they happen to have in front of them if I stop here or whatever. That's a fun decision to make. And
it's a group project, but it's a funny one.
And I think you had mentioned earlier one of the event cards like triggers when it's completed, but most of them, I'll be honest, I thought all of them just trigger by just sitting out there. And like adding more black dice that you have to fight or putting neutral guys into random building spaces.
No, you're right.
So when I was learning this game, it was again another thing that was like just countered my normal board game brain expectations because it took me a really long time to understand. I had to keep like one of the people we were playing and learning with was Jared, and he kept being like, guys, nobody else is fighting any of these events but me. And I was just kind of thinking like, but why would I contribute to that? It's hurting us all equally, and now that I played it more, I realized like how it can be a really efficient use of actions just for getting points and stuff. But it does sort of be like, why am I helping other people by doing this just a bit?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's like the wall in the Game of Thrones board game. That was a time appropriate callback.
Okay, great. Yeah. I'll just take your word for that.
Yeah. Another thing, it's really interesting, Jake, that the game changes in length based on player count. In a 4-player game, it's a 6-round game. So you see more of the activity cards earlier. You have more time to sort of strategize around them. And I think that makes sense because the opportunity to claim them is a bit lower based on the number of players. And 3-player game, it's 5 rounds. In a 2-player game, there's just 4 rounds. That 2-player game goes quick.
Yeah. It's nice. I don't know that it's best at 2. It also 2 has the variant where you each get 2 of those hidden character
Character
cards.
cards. Great decision.
Yeah, good choice. I don't know if it's best at 2s, but I do like because it feels like you're missing a lot of that interaction and kind of like the funny like groupthink that can happen in 3 and 4 player games.
Yeah.
But it is nice that it whips so quickly at that player count. It's also interesting too because like today we also think like the more player count, like the more down, like the longer that's bad. So it's just funny to see a game that's just like, yes, it'll be longer because it's with more people, and it's actually just rounds longer too. So
Yeah.
we're kind of like double dosing you with game length time.
And you have even more decisions on a given turn because there's going to be more dice out there.
I don't
No,
know.
I don't
think
that's true.
so.
That's
Yeah.
not true. Yeah. Anyway,
We don't know. We'll be honest. We have no idea.
no, that's not true.
Okay.
To be honest, I was also sort of surprised by the game can feel kind of procedural in some ways too. They're like, okay, we got to reveal these activity cards. We have to resolve the events. We have to, we get an income every round, and then we have to pay salaries for our workers. And there's different salaries that cost different amounts, right?
Nothing is like intuitive to learn. Everything is like, here's the rule for how much a white die costs versus a red die versus a yellow die. It's like, come on, game. Why
Your
are
red
you
dice
like
cost
this?
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's a lot of edges. So yeah, maybe I'm really glad that you kind of highlighted here, Jake, that like polish isn't quite the right word. It's that it's fully realizing what it wants to be, which is a messy, beautiful, interactive Euro-ish game.
But I do also like the more you play this game, the more you realize that each of these edge cases that is annoying to learn, admittedly, is there for a reason. Like the red die are just a little bit better because they can be used to fight the black dice more efficiently. The red cards are really the red action cards are often tailored towards fighting events, which I think I already mentioned seems to be one of the most efficient things you can be doing for the game. So like it does make sense just from a balance perspective, like because players would naturally be incentivized by the game mechanisms to want these dice a little bit more. They cost a little bit more to have at the start of your turn.
Yeah, and it is also cool, Jake, that the different events that come out, they're set to come out at different ages. So you're seeing more and more powerful activities that you can potentially do. One that, is I find to be really fun is the one that converts influence just straight into victory points. That's the Troubadour, which lets you trade. You have to divide your red die value that you're bringing your workforce by 3, and it turns 3 influence into 2 victory points. That one's fun and kind of sets up the potential to maybe bluff around, oh, I have the influence card, I'm going to invest in influence early, and then if that card comes out, you can just be like, no, I'm going to liquidate to these points.
Pivot.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
And we mentioned the dividing by 3 as being sort of like a pain point, but it also makes a lot of times like the efficiency question really interesting, so if you have a divide by 3 and you have a 5 dice, do I go for that, or can I find something better to like use that full die value? Or maybe I pay 4 coins to use my opponent's 1 dice to ump it, whatever.
Yeah.
Like there's decisions like that sort of riddled throughout the game that I find really fun to just kind of look at and navigate on my turn.
It's also neat the way the costing works for buying other people's dice, that you're sort of incentivized to. It's great to buy 1 die, but if you start buying 2 or 3, all of a sudden it costs so much that sort of like it's asking you to like engage with this mechanism, but don't go overboard.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really well designed element too.
I did want to say this because I think it was on the Board Game Barrage podcast where they've talked about this game and really like it. And sort of the quintessential impression that I got from that is that you're sort of just waiting around the table and just like hoping nobody buys a specific die from you. I didn't really feel that as much. I don't know. Did you have that impression a lot? Like, I guess I just, maybe because I knew that going into this game, like I didn't feel a super strong sense of like ownership of like, these dice are mine. I don't know.
I didn't either. I think also the fact that they sit on the middle of the table is a good design element to kind of signal, right? Like this isn't yours. It's just with you.
You can just use these ones for free. And these ones cost money.
Yeah, and you get paid if you use these ones. Also, you roll a 6 and instantly it's like, well, I'm not going to get to use that unless I'm the first or second player.
Right.
Not always, but like typically, the 6s and the 5s aren't long for this world.
Right, exactly.
They're too mathematically useful. Yeah.
All right. Well, Brendan, any closing thoughts? We've sort of been doing a little bit of closing thoughts here. What do you got? Any like favorite decision in the game? Are you going to keep playing? Where are you at with this one?
Yeah, it's not often, Jake, that we play a game a dozen times. I give it a 7.5 and I'm hungry to keep playing it after our discussion. But I think I am now. I want to keep playing. I'd love to keep playing at 2. I think we're playing a 2-player game right now, and I think that it allows you to interact with the decisions, the sort of optimization puzzle, even a little bit more, and there's fewer moving elements. I'd love to play it that way a little more. I'd like to play it at 4 on the table. I guess my answer is yes. And favorite decision, I don't know. It's fun when you see a little combo that comes out in the activity cards and you get just a brief moment where you can exploit it. I think there's exciting turns, exciting moments in TWAHH. It's a game with a good arc because it's built to have a good arc, and then it's designed such that there's an exciting reveal at the end. So overall, I think if I want to end on one thing, it's just that TWAHH is great, and it has this really great arc with interesting and variable tactical decisions.
Cool. Yeah, and for me, I think TWAHH is one of the games that we've covered in a deep dive format on the show that I'm most eager to play on the table. And I wonder if, some of that more emotional elements in the game about like, oh, you stole my die. Like, I kind of want that. And I wonder if playing it live on the table, you have more of that sense of like waiting. And then the person right in front of you takes it and you're like, damn it, that was my move. Where if you're playing it online and asynchronously, you don't really have that. You just, okay, it's my turn. I look at the board and I do my tactical move.
Yeah.
So I think that playing live is going to heighten that sort of emotional aspect of the game for me and maybe make me like it even more. And I think also, maybe some of that like bluffing, feinting around those character cards, which I kind of indicated, I don't think you get very much, again, playing digitally online. I think that can come out too more in like the above the table talk.
Sure.
Like, oh, what are you doing over there, Jared? I see you got
Mr.
a lot of
Influence.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right there. Oh, you just hit 12. That's interesting. Like that kind of stuff could happen at the table that we're not getting in the chat online. So yeah, I mean, I loved it. I want to keep playing it. And I think, it could really grow into a favorite of mine if it's as good on the table as I think it might be.
Yeah. I think this is this to me, TWAHH feels like a game where it's sort of like your tastes, how they've shifted to be even a smidge more interactive over the course of these last 2 years of us doing the show, Jake, towards the Knizia realm, plus your love of Euro optimization games. TWAHH seems like it's right there. And if you have a really good play that pops on the table, I could see at the end of the year where we're looking back on games, sort of you going, TWAHH is one of my games of the year. This is just, I'm so glad I experienced it. So we'll see.
Awesome. All right.
Let's thank our patrons one more time for supporting the show, inviting us to play TWAHH. It was awesome. Thank you for voting on this game. We're really excited to see what you select next. And as a reminder to everyone, if you're curious about learning more about our Patreon, I won't go on, but just check out decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon for more.
All right. And until next week, thank you so much for listening to Decision Space. We want to thank Hembury, as always, for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. And keep your eyes peeled because there might be a special bonus episode in your feed later this week. Thanks so much and have a good week. Bye, y'all.
Close enough, 'cause I am reaching out.